Happy Friday, everyone. I'm Anjanette Levy here, doing this week from my dining room and on the edge of my living room. And Mack Mariani is again here in his kitchen with the fabulous, wood doors or faux wood doors on the refrigerator. Every time I see that, I just think fancy, fancy, fancy.
Not that fancy, but thank you very much.
All right, Max. So I just checked in on both candidates, President Trump and Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in Iowa. He's going to be speaking momentarily if he hasn't started already. President Trump is in Michigan and then going to Green Bay, where I worked for 5.5 years. I consider it the coldest place on earth, but apparently, in October, it's not so bad heading into November. It can be, though. So the state of the race at this point, Mac, what are you thinking?
Well, what I think is the candidates are sending us some very interesting messages with where they're going. So one of the places that Joe Biden, I think it was going today, or maybe it's tomorrow. He's going to Iowa, which is a positive sign for Joe Biden because Iowa is a state that's generally conservative and generally tends to vote more Republican, although I think Barack Obama did carry it. But Biden's there. That's a suggestion that he's on the offense. But then at the same time, he's got a schedule in Minnesota, which is a state that the Democrats haven't lost, I think, in like 40 years or something. So that sends a sign that he sees some weakness in Minnesota, a place where the polls have him up 10 or 12 points. Trump for his part, they had Mike Pence down in North Carolina. I think it was yesterday. They had Trump is doing the swing through Michigan and Minnesota today, Michigan and Wisconsin today. So the upper Midwest is going to be the path very clearly. If Trump is going to win, he's going to have to win at least 2 of those states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. He's going to win at least 2 of those and hold all the other ones. And then you have Kamala Harris. She's in Texas of all places. And so what this tells me is you've got candidates going places where Republicans have never won, and you've got Democrats going in places where Republicans usually win or where Democrats almost always lose, like Texas. And it suggests to me that nobody knows what's going on to some extent, right? Like, or they have way different polls than all the rest of us do, because I think the amount of turnout is just so high. And I think that adds a layer of unpredictability. We already have, by the end of this week, by election day, we're going to probably have about 3 million absentee votes. We only had 5.1 million absentee or total votes in Ohio in 2016. So, I mean, we're almost 3/5 of the way there before election day. So what does that mean? Is that good for Biden? Is it good for Trump? I don't think either campaign really knows.
That's really funny because when you said you don't think anybody knows what's going on, I kind of wondered the same thing, because it seems like they're throwing the proverbial stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And I remember, I don't know if you recall this, but I remember back in 2016, it seemed to me that at the last minute, the Trump campaign went to Minnesota. And they went to an area where they knew they would get TV market coverage in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. And they were trying, or were hopeful, or trying to flip Minnesota the last time. So I don't know what they're seeing that they think there's a path there. Just so you know, I read an article the other day that talked about corn and corn farmers, and something that Biden said, it was corn and ethanol. So they were trying to get into the farmers, to reach the farmers there, because of Biden's comments during the last debate about moving to, clean energy and away from fossil fuels or oil. Remember those comments that he made. So apparently that will impact the corn farmers. That's what I read in this article.
That's interesting, because I think it's funny because we all think, fracking, because we're in Ohio, and I'm sure in Texas they're thinking oil, and in Minnesota they're thinking corn. So when you say energy, it means lots of different things for different people.
Yeah, if Biden would have said something about beer, people in Cincinnati might just start going crazy. I'm just kidding. Get rid of beer.
Wisconsin's
With
pretty
our
big.
brewing history, that was a joke.
I knew that. I
Just so
caught that.
people don't start getting mad at me. Okay, so that's all very interesting. I saw that Kamala Harris was in Texas too, and I was like, what is she doing there? But obviously they think that they can somehow flip Texas. If you recall, Bill Clinton, I think, won Texas and won Georgia. Um, I heard Herschel Walker on Bill Cunningham's show the other day, and he said there's no way Biden wins Georgia. He's apparently from Georgia, and he's a Trump supporter. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that? Do you have
Well,
any
it's
thoughts?
interesting because in each of these places, there's a slightly different coalition that the campaigns are trying to appeal to. In the case of Texas, it's a huge Hispanic population and one that traditionally doesn't come out to vote in large numbers. And the fact that the COVID situation has led to a dramatic increase in the number of voting days and early vote. I think there's a whole week of early voting there now, and there usually isn't any early voting in Texas. And so one of the things that's done is it's made it possible for the Democrats to work really hard at bringing out the Hispanic vote. And I think I read earlier today that more people have voted in Texas already than voted in 2016 at all. And so they've already exceeded the total number of votes just in the early vote. So now what does that mean? I think this, just like in Ohio, one of the questions we're going to have is, are we just cannibalizing the election day vote, right? Like, so my wife and my daughter went to vote already. They would almost 100% have voted on election day anyway. Like, they were not going to be non-voters, but they voted early. I typically vote on election day. I still will. So the question is, do these early voters, are they people who are going to vote on election day or not? And I don't think we know that for sure until after election day, right? After election day, we're going to have a sense of whether or not we just spread out the voters into a different pattern. Sorry, my dog's drinking water and it's very loud.
I didn't hear it.
Well, it sounds very loud from here. So the question is, what does this look like at the end of election day? I mean, we're all thinking it means huge turnout. I think it does. I think that we're going to have tremendous turnout. I mean, in Texas, certainly that's the case. In Ohio, almost certainly. And who does that advantage is the question that both campaigns are asking, which is why they're, all over the place trying to win votes.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about how you like to vote on election day, and that's what you're going to do. I typically like to vote on election day too. I like going in and just the tradition of it and getting the little sticker and the whole 9 yards. Plus, I don't like the idea of like voting way too early because of all the 11th hour stuff that can happen. So it's
Yeah,
just
I like. Sorry, I gotta let my dog out because he's just gonna bark.
Oh, that's okay. You'll have to introduce, by the way, when you talk about your pet on here, you have to then later introduce the pet.
Oh, I'll introduce Bennett. He has a phone on because he's old and bites his feet. But what were we talking about? Voting on election day. So I always kind of think about it as almost like a secular sacrament. Like, it's like this. It's like one of the few things that kind of bring people together. And I always like the idea that as citizens, we're all standing in line together and you're with your neighbors and you've got this big decision. As you pointed out, that one of the big changes of having early voting, especially early voting as extended as we do in Ohio, is there are things happening that kind of that break late. And I think campaigns have had to adjust to that, right? And so now, rather than getting one big October surprise 3 days before the election, the campaigns are trying to they're dropping 3 or 4 different October surprises throughout. So they're always kind of thinking about, how do we get people's attention? How do we get their vote? And they have to do that over the course of a longer period of time rather than focusing on kind of one day.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, and here's the deal, Latino voters. You had brought that up before, and I'm looking at this story right now, and it talked about how President Trump has sought to improve his standing among Latino voters in Florida. Apparently, last time around, I remember there being like a lot, I could think a lot of Cuban um, or voters of Cuban, who came from Cuba, who lived in the Miami area, I guess, rallied around Trump and helped him win in Florida, because I think he won by a pretty slim margin. And there's a story out today. Maybe it's not from today, but it was yesterday, talking about an NBC News Marist poll conducted back in August and early September. And it said that Trump, back in this poll in August, late August, early September, was ahead 50-46 among likely Latino voters statewide, which was a pre-election warning sign for Joe Biden.
Yeah,
I think that's interesting.
And it's interesting too how the mix of Latino voters in different states is different, right? Like you mentioned the Cuban roots of many of the voters in Miami and other parts of Florida, versus, if you go and there's a fairly big Puerto Rican population in Florida, but there's also a Venezuelan population and I think Guatemalan population as well that's growing in Florida. And what you see is, I think one of the interesting parts of the Cuban population is there tended to be kind of two tiers of voting, that the first generation Cubans who came here were very Republican because they were very anti-communist. And then the second generation were starting to move and shift a little bit more towards Democrats. My guess is that continues to happen. But AOC and the Democrat and Bernie Sanders and maybe Antifa and some of the stuff that has been happening over the last few months, that has been more kind of openly embracing of socialism, that group is very anti-communist and very anti-socialist. And so, and even the second generation harbors a bit of distrust for socialism, which is that has been true of most Americans for a long time, but that fear of socialism and that sort of boogeyman of socialism and the idea that you can't really talk about socialism has somewhat dissipated. There was some survey research that showed something like 40% of Democrats had a positive view of socialism, right? Which is a pretty huge number. And that's the sort of thing that turns off Cuban voters. In Texas, there aren't very many Cuban voters, and so you don't see that that same dynamic.
Right, because they were coming from Mexico or Latin America.
Yeah, exactly.
So this Quinnipiac poll I heard about this morning says that President Trump, I guess, is down in Ohio. It's the Ohio poll, the Quinnipiac University poll. I keep hearing from people that Trump's going to win Ohio, but this poll apparently was right last time. It says Biden leads Trump by 5 in trend bucking Quinnipiac poll. That's the headline. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, pollsters are trying very hard to get things right. I think that they feel a little bit burned last time. Many of them, Quinnipiac did pretty well, but there were some others that did okay. I think the challenge is, how to model turnout and who's showing up, right? And I think that the pollsters aren't quite sure about that, and I think it's gotten even trickier because of some dynamics in the electorate. One of the dynamics, I think, is that white working class vote that has been kind of moving towards Trump, which used to be a very heavily Democratic group of people. And in the past, they could be more confident about that group. And I think that in the most recent election after 2016, it's become a bit harder to kind of pinpoint which direction they're going. It's also, I think, difficult to know for sure. It's a difficult group to reach. So whereas African Americans are a difficult group to reach, but when they collect a lot of data on race, but they don't always collect data on income. That takes extra questions. They don't always collect that data on education. Again, that takes extra questions. And so probably the better polls are going to be the ones that have that sort of full understanding of who they're talking to. and making sure that you're getting enough of the white working class vote in your models, and not just getting white Americans who have college degrees, who are actually the most likely to answer the phone and respond to a poll. So it's a tricky sort of dynamic. My sense in Ohio, if I had to bet, I'd say Trump probably carries Ohio. I mean, if he doesn't carry Ohio, we don't need to worry about Michigan and Wisconsin and all those others. But it's the dynamics of the race, I think, are that Trump has, he won the state by 9 points. And it's just very hard to see a swing of that margin from one election to another. It's not impossible. It's impossible that Trump loses Ohio and loses North Carolina and loses Georgia and loses Michigan and loses Wisconsin, loses Pennsylvania, and this is a complete blowout. I mean, that's still entirely possible. But if in the last couple days, and I think one of the things we've seen over the last few weeks is it does feel like there's a bit more momentum on Trump's side. Whether it's enough to bring him over, I think that's another question. But it's also possible that we start to see that the polls are all off just a little, 2 or 3 points, and then in the last few days things close up a little bit, and Trump ends up winning very narrowly in all of the states that I mentioned. In which case, he's going to be able to win the Electoral College, and that's all you need to do.
Right. Well, it's going to be very interesting. I think predictions are dangerous. I mean, look at 2016. And I remember on election day back in 2016, I don't know if you remember this, but this is when how Nate Silver was supposed to be like the, election god or whatever, like he was supposed to be like, he was it. And then all of a sudden, I think the day before the election, his little meter that showed like Hillary Clinton winning had a like 98.9% chance of winning was all of a sudden going like this. He kept adjusting it like throughout the 24 hours. And then I just thought, and then he was like kind of flipping out on Twitter, and I was kind of like, I'm not so sure that counts. Like, you can't just adjust it in the last 24 hours and then say you were right, because he was totally wrong. So I think it's interesting, like how it could have been. So it was so bizarre last time. Whether or not that happens again, we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe we'll check back on Monday.
Well, just very quickly, I think that goes to what Silver was talking about recently was where he sees the difference is that in 2016 there were a large number of undecided voters, not large, but let's say 8%. Virtually nobody today is undecided, and it truly undecided. And so that maybe the number of undecideds might be down to 3 or 4%. And so the late, where Trump won 3/4 of those undecided voters in 2016, there just aren't enough of them this time to push him over if the polls are right. Whereas before, I think what Nate Silver would say is, listen, the polls were right. We just missed this late break to Trump among undecideds. It's just that we didn't have all the data yet. Now, I think he'd say, listen, we have all the data. There aren't enough undecideds to switch it to Trump. If Trump wins, that means that there was something wrong with the polls. That means the polls missed something larger that was going on.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks so much, Mac. I feel like, if we have time, maybe we can do this again on Monday, maybe check back in if I can figure out how to get the whole Facebook Live thing working so we can take questions. I mean, I don't even know. We'll talk about that when we're off, but thanks again for doing this. Is the dog nearby?
Where is he?
If he's not nearby, it's okay.
He's
here. Is he a little dog or a big dog?
He's a big dog.
Oh, he's a big dog, so you can't pick him up and hold him up.
Here, Ben, he looks very sad and pathetic.
Oh, what happened to him?
He bites his feet, and so we have to keep the cone on him.
Oh, poor thing. Well, he seems sweet.
And he's here, and we're enjoying his company while we can.
Well, thanks so much again. Have a great weekend. Have a good Halloween. Happy Halloween.
You too. Bye-bye.